Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to episode number 19 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. In the last episode, we've started traveling on a path that will bring us deep into the history of the Roman Empire. Like in all good stories, we've started at the beginning, exploring the different foundation myths. Yes, myths in plural, because if you remember, while the story of Romulus and Remus might be the most well-known today, it's far from being the only one. From steamy promises of forgiveness to a divine cattle thief, up to a hero directly connected with the mythical Troy, the Romans and just about everyone living in the ancient world tried their hand at writing a foundation myth for one of the mightiest empires of their times. That the myth of Romulus and Remus still endures to this day is a testament to how attached the Romans had become to the mythical founder, regardless of his penchant for murder. And honestly, as we will see in this episode, killing his brother was not the only crime Romulus committed in his life, even though it was probably the worst. While the Romans themselves might have regarded him with some fondness and a lot of pride, by our standards, Romulus should have spent his life in a prison cell rather than on the throne. For the Romans, though, their beloved founder and first king was untouchable. While they did their very best to forget that Remus existed at all, some historical theories even say that Remus was added into the story at a much later time. Even later reworkings of the myth did nothing to the figure of Romulus. While Virgil had written the Aeneid as a way to ennoble Augustus by linking him directly to heroes and gods, he'd done it in a way which managed to incorporate Rome's first king in the narrative. He'd done so because for the Romans, Romulus wasn't a myth. The existence of the 7 kings of Rome is still a point of contention between historians today. Some say all of them are legendary. Others that while their deeds might be real, their characters aren't. Some others have proposed a compromise, where the first 2 kings, Romulus and Numa Pompilius, are nothing but legends, while the other 5 have some elements of truth. In any case, today it's very clear for us that Romulus did not exist as a man, but in a society where it was widely believed that the gods walked the same paths as the mortals, he was as real as Augustus. While the beginning of his story is well known, most people are unfamiliar with how Romulus's life continued after the killing of his brother and the mythical founding of Rome. You might be inclined to think that Remus's murder had been nothing but an act of momentary madness, regretted immediately after it had happened. In reality, though, Romulus is quite the villainous character, at least by our standards. The fact that the Romans continued to revere him as a god under the name Quirinus for all their history tells us that they might have perceived his actions less maliciously than we might do today. And even if the methods Romulus employed to make Rome great can be considered criminal by our standards, they gave the Romans their pride as warriors. We cannot judge the past with the standards of today. We can only watch it unfold and accept that time does bring a different perspective to things. It's time for us now, fellow travelers, to embark on the next leg of our journey, to see how the first king of the Romans brought greatness and prosperity to his newly built city. Welcome to the story of Romulus, the first king of Rome. At the end of the last episode, we had left Romulus just after the murder of his twin brother Remus, as he prepared to govern the newly founded city of Rome on his own. That Romulus had killed Remus so he wouldn't have to share his power seemed a given even in antiquity, But I think that if he'd known in advance about the myriad of problems which were about to land on his lap, maybe Romulus would have kept Remus alive, at least to delegate some of the most difficult tasks. The first snag in Romulus's great plan of world domination came immediately after laying the first stone of his city. While Numitor, his grandfather, had given both the twins permissions to create a new settlement rather than wait for the crown of Alba Longa, he never had any intention of helping them or sending people to populate this new city. If the twins wanted inhabitants, they would need to find them on their own. And when Romulus killed Remus, he was left to figure out how to solve his population problem on his own. Step 1 seemed a given. Maybe Numitor hadn't wanted to send people to his grandchild's city, but he wasn't the only king in the area. So Romulus asked around to see if anyone had people to spare. Since none of the other settlements ended up being willing to send settlers for his pet project, Romulus was forced to employ some, let's say, creative recruitment methods. He declared that his new settlement, Rome, was going to be an asylum. The term asylum in Latin means sanctuary for refugees, so his city would provide a place of safety for people facing persecution. Putting like this, it sounds like he was heading for a diverse community of people who might have been ostracized by their own cities for differences of opinion. In reality, what he got was a hodgepodge of common criminals who had seen this new city as the perfect place to escape the law in their own settlements. Maybe they were also good farmers or shepherds, but they were probably not the best settlers, all things considered. In the end, though, Romulus's trick got him what he so desperately needed: new settlers. Unfortunately for him, they were all men with quite the temper and penchant for violence. As the story tells us, there wasn't a woman in sight. This meant that, for one, without any means of reproduction, the new settlement would not last long. For two, this volatile mix of toxic masculinity, testosterone and violence had a very high chance of imploding and would never be taken seriously by its neighbours. The first step in his quest to gain some respectability, though, was to establish a form of government which could produce a representative for the city of Rome. When Romulus asked the citizen how they wanted to be ruled, the unanimous answer was that they wanted him as their king. Ever wary of upsetting the gods by showing too much arrogance, Romulus answered that he would be happy to accept only if the omens were favourable. They were. Jupiter in particular made his choice clear by sending down a lightning strike which flashed from left to right, which was the most auspicious direction. So Romulus took the crown and became the first king of Rome. For the newly crowned King Romulus, the next action item on his list was to find himself and his followers a wife. To be fair to the poor guy, he did try diplomacy first. Following the advice of his own newly created Senate, he sent ambassadors to all the neighboring rulers, offering great living conditions in his newly built city to all settlers who would come join them. The answers he got back were all one and the same. No, thank you. After all, Romulus's new city was made entirely of people who had been rejected by the neighboring kingdoms on account of their criminal activities. The neighboring kings didn't understand why, after having expelled these people from their cities, they should send their own upstanding citizens to live with them. And when Romulus hinted that he might have liked to be introduced to some young girls of marrying age for himself and his citizens, the answering no was even more resounding and firm. No father was going to send his own daughter into a den of criminals. As diplomacy failed him, Romulus resorted to a tried-and-true method: violence. If the women he had politely requested weren't going to come his way peacefully, then he and his citizens were going to go get them. Flying into a rage and coming with an army he didn't currently possess to his neighbors' doors wasn't going to get Romulus very far. So he decided to swallow his anger for the moment, plaster the most welcoming smile on his face, and invite his neighbors to some solemn games in honor of Neptune. Apparently, turning down an invitation to a sacred festival, even if it had come from criminals, was a big no in antiquity. So the neighboring rulers packed their bags, their courts, their people and their families, and arrived in Rome at the appointed time. As was the plan, while the people were engrossed in the games, Romulus gave the signal. We are told that the signal in question called for the king himself to stand up, fold his cloak in front of him, and then majestically throw it backwards. Imagine a movie villain with a cloak. That's more or less the motion Romulus was going for. At the signal, the Romans started a riot, and in the following panic, they kidnapped the women. Somehow, they managed to only get the virgin ones, except for one married matrona, Hersilia, who would later become Romulus's own wife and would give him a daughter and a son. Historians tell us that the Romans at most kidnapped 30 women in total, which is a lot, of course, but most probably wouldn't have solved their problem anyway. This would become known as the rape of the Sabines, from the name of one of the peoples whose women had fallen prey of the Roman schemes. While the Romans quite surely forced themselves on the women, the word rape in this case comes from the Latin raptio, which means kidnapping. We're told that the Romans dutifully divided the spoils between them, with the youngest and most beautiful going to the senators. While fratricide was such a marring stain on Romulus's reputation that the Romans basically erased the Remus in its entirety, the kidnapping of women for reproductive purposes wasn't considered as damning. The women didn't take their kidnapping standing down, but according to the stories, they were worn down by the Romans' affectionate behavior towards them. In order to get their women back, the tribes declared war on the Romans. At this point, Romulus had actually gotten around to create an army, which, given that it was made of men who already proved themselves handy with a blade, was quite a force to be reckoned with. While sufficiently powerful, the Caninenses Crustumini and Antemnatus quickly fell under the Roman swords, their kings dead or imprisoned, and their territories seized. The Sabines, though, were quite a bit tougher than the others. Knowing that their best chance at getting their women back lay in subterfuge, they decided to head directly to Rome, without fighting the Romans head-on in a pitched battle. As they were camping out on the Capitoline Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills, where now the mayor of Rome has their office, they were approached by a young girl named Tarpeia, daughter of Spurius Tarpeius, Roman governor of the citadel on the Capitoline Hill. According to the legends, she was a young Vestal, apparently the only proper career for a Roman woman, since she's the second one we meet, who offered to open the gates for the Sabines in exchange for what they were wearing on their left arms. She had been eyeing the glittering golden armilla, the arm bracelets, gracing the Sabines' left arms, but what she got after she'd opened the gates for them was to be buried underneath an avalanche of heavy shields, also worn on the left arms by the Sabines. Being a Vestal at the beginning of Rome was quite a hazardous job. One of the ancient historians, Plutarch, mentioned quite a different motive for Tarpeia. She didn't open the doors out of greed, but out of love for the king of the Sabines, Titus Statius. After entering the city, he took what he wanted, tossed her off a cliff, and buried her under the shields of his soldiers, just to show others what would happen to traitors. Apparently, there was a cliff in Rome, not quite sure which one, as it kept being moved over the centuries, called Tarpeian Rock, from where traitors were thrown off as punishment. Led by Titus Statius, the Sabines managed to infiltrate the city, but when the time came to conquer the Forum, the center of day-to-day life in Rome, its gates were miraculously protected by boiling jets of water created by Janus, the god of gates, the one with the two faces, so the Sabines couldn't even enter the square. Seeing that their attempt at conquering the city had failed, the Sabines doubled back to meet Romulus and his Romans head-on in the area between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. Given the recent rains, the area had become a mud field, and the battle which took place there would later be known as the Battle of the Lacus Curtius. The Romans were led by Romulus himself and Hostus Hostilius. Keep in mind the family name, because we'll meet his grandkid later on in the series. While the Sabines were led by Titus Statius and Metzius Curtius, the one to whom the battle is named after since he died in it. Despite numerous skirmishes and minor engagements, neither side was able to clearly prevail over the other, so it was decided to solve the question once and for all with a pitched battle. The two armies seemed evenly matched until Romulus fought Metzius Curtius directly, wounding him. The Sabines, though, immediately turned the tide again by trying to bash Romulus's head in with a stone. Seeing the impossibility of prevailing over the Romans in pitched battle, the Sabines decided to retreat back to the citadel on the Capitoline hill, thus gaining the high ground over the Romans. Trying to recover the citadel, Hostus Hostilius was killed, but immediately avenged by Romulus himself, who finally managed to kill Metzius Curtius. The war seemed destined to go on forever, with neither side prevailing over the other, until the Sabine women, now Roman wives, rushed onto the battlefield and put themselves in between the two armies. Their heartfelt prayers of not being made both widows and orphans in the same day was enough to get the men to stop fighting and figure out a peace treaty. It was decided that the administrative power for both tribes, the Romans and the Sabines, would be transferred to Rome. But in exchange, the Romans were to call themselves Quirites, like the inhabitants of the town of Cures, the birthplace of the Sabines king Titus Statius. Even later, when the Sabines became fully integrated with the Romans, the term Quirites remained, as it indicated those who were Roman citizens in their full right. Since both Sabines and Romans were proud people, and they had already partially merged when the Sabine women had become Romans' wives, it was decided that both Titus Statius and Romulus would continue being kings and rule together over both people. The co-kingship which Romulus had tried so hard to avoid with his brother to the point of killing him was suddenly thrusted upon him, and with a former enemy nonetheless. Despite being effectively Romulus's co-ruler, Titus Statius is, weirdly enough, not considered a king of Rome. This was probably due to the fact that the two tribes were still, in effect, separate entities, despite living in the same city. The two of them ruled together the Romans and the Sabines effectively for 5 years. Then, in the 6th year, they ran into the first disagreement, and honestly, also the last. As the story goes, some of Tatius' friends had victimized some Laurenti. The Laurenti were a neighboring tribe which, according to Virgil's Aeneid, were directly descendants of King Latinus, the one who'd given his daughter Lavinia to Aeneas in marriage. The Laurenti ambassadors had come to Rome to complain about the treatment directly to Titus Statius, who had dismissed them out of hand. angry over such treatment, it seemed as if the Laurenti took the matter into their own hands and killed Titus Statius as he was presiding over a sacrifice in Lavinium, one of their cities. Despite the clear insult to his position, Romulus might not have liked to share the power or even Titus Statius himself, but he had still been a co-ruler of Rome. Romulus didn't do anything, seemingly preferring to keep Rome's alliance with the Laurenti, and probably secretly very pleased that he was free once again to be the sole ruler of Rome. Somehow, after this, Romulus managed to rule for the next 32 years with nothing too major happening, at least not on the foreign affairs front. The first king of Rome spent the last 3 decades of his reign basically creating most of the Romans' beloved infrastructures from scratch, or so the legend tells us. Many of the great staples of the Roman culture are accredited to Romulus himself. As he was considered the first ruler of Rome, historians have argued that, obviously, the very first set of rules was established by him. Since Numa Pompilius, king number 2, is also credited with having given Rome a law system, Romulus might not have done a very good job. Romulus was also considered responsible for the creation of the mighty Roman army and for another Roman staple, the Senate. The Senate was a governing body meant to function as the counterpoint of the king. When Romulus founded it, it was an assembly of 100 patres, hence why the Romans would call their ruling class patricians. Since those picked had been quite elderly, they were given the name senators, from the Latin senex, old person. Starting from just 100 people, the Senate expanded over the centuries, reaching 900 senators, which were cut down to 600 by Augustus, and their number was never touched again. It is interesting to know that most depictions of the Roman Senate are inaccurate. We usually think of the senators arranged in a semicircle around an open space where orators are supposed to stand and talk. In reality, judging from remains of the Curia Julia, they were sat in straight and parallel lines on either side of the building. Most interestingly, though, at least for me, is the fact that Romulus is accredited with having left quite a number of rules regarding women. He stipulated that, by law, a woman couldn't divorce her husband, but she herself could be repudiated if she tried to poison her children, if she was an adulteress, or if she decided to change the house keys. Technically, the women held the keys to the house, though not the keys to the safe, where the money was usually kept. And I suppose that changing them, thus locking the husband out of the house, was a crime punishable by law. If a man repudiated a woman for any of the aforementioned reasons, then he was within his lawful rights. If he, on the other hand, decided to repudiate his wife for any other reason, then he had to pay her a share of his fortune. It's unclear how big such a percentage should have been, and offer another equal share of his fortune to the Mithras temple. Moreover, the husband was supposed to make a sacrifice to the god of the underworld, Pluto. Interestingly enough, Romulus didn't set any punishment for patricide, because apparently he thought that killing one's father was something no one would ever stoop to. Brother, yes. Father, not so much. Unfortunately for him, though, some 2 centuries later, another king of Rome, the 7th and last, would prove him wrong, when he, alongside his wife, killed his father-in-law. So, for 37 years in total, according to the calculation done by later Roman historians, Romulus ruled his new city, creating laws and infrastructures as he saw fit. Then, one day, According to the legends, it was either the 5th or the 7th of July, 716 BC. The 55-year-old king suddenly disappeared under the astonished eyes of the troops he was personally addressing on the Campus Martius. As if to justify this surprising vanishing act, later historians report that there had been a storm that day and even a sun eclipse, and that had been during the eclipse that Romulus had vanished. Since most of the soldiers mentioned seeing a cloud enveloping the king just before his disappearance, it seemed obvious to all that Romulus had ascended to the status of a god. To be fair, it doesn't seem that obvious to me, but then again, I'm not an ancient Roman. From that moment on, since the absence of a body and the clear signs of godly intervention made it clear that Romulus hadn't disappeared in normal circumstances, the Romans started to revere him as a god, under the name of Quirinus, son of Mars, king and founding father of Rome. The second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, built a temple dedicated to Romulus on a hill, which had remained nameless until that moment, but from then on was called the Quirinal. Today is the official residence of the President of the Italian Republic. If, like me, you aren't quite sold on the entire ascension business, there is also another version of Romulus's death. This one a little more human, so to speak. In this story, we are presented with a version of Romulus which is a bit less polished and divine. We are told that over the course of his reign, Romulus started to increasingly gather power in his hands, placing more and more restrictions on the Senate, so much that this political organ had become more decoration than a functional part of the governing system. Especially since the sudden death of Titus Statius, Romulus had become increasingly more paranoid, and the senators had been looked at with suspicion as potential enemies of the state. It was clear that at some point the senators had reached their breaking point. We're not told what exactly caused the senators to act. It might have been a long-standing plan finally being given the green light. It might have been a spur-of-the-moment thing. In both cases, the senators acted during one of the sessions of the King's Council in the Temple of Vulcan in the Roman Forum. What happened is unclear, but the result was that Romulus was killed, and his body turned into pieces that each senator brought back to their curia, or the group of people they represented. Maybe the Senate would have gotten away with the murder had they hidden the corpse somewhere out of sight. But since each senator had quite literally decided to take home a piece, they were immediately discovered. Nothing in the stories points to any kind of punishment for the senators. He simply went on to rule the city during the interregnum until the elected Romulus' successor, Numa Pompilius. And so ends the story of the first king of Rome. Of divine origins, he was a fratricidal warmongering tyrant, but one whose actions were the initial spark and foundation of what would later become one of the mightiest empires in history. Romulus' descent into tyranny didn't discourage the Romans from electing 6 other kings after him. It was only when the last of them, Tarquinius the Proud, showed himself to be nothing but a tyrant that the Romans decided it was a time for a system change. That, though, would come much later. In the next leg of our journey, we'll meet those 6 kings, their innovations, their virtues and their vices, and we'll ask ourselves the questions: did the legendary 7 kings of Rome really exist? And so here we are, yet again at the end of another path. As we dive deeper and deeper into early Roman history, I discover more and more details I never knew about. Sure, we are told the big stories in school, but many characters slip through the cracks. Before doing some research for this episode, I never even knew that Tarpeia existed, nor that she had died in such a terrible way. Even the character of Titus Statius was mostly unknown to me, a forgettable footnote in Romulus's story. I think, for me, this is the beauty of this podcast. It has allowed me to go deeper, to branch wider into known and common stories. I thought I would grow bored on the same old legends I'd been told since I was a child, but in reality, I've never been more excited. I thank you all for traveling with me, for giving me this opportunity to explore new and old stories. If you want to know more, please join me on my Instagram channel, The Apple and the Hero. And when you do, please say hi. I am very happy to make your acquaintance. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.